Hey folks, welcome back to Nomad Boatbuilding. Now today I'm building the Catalina Wherry. We're going to be working on something kind of different. Now Joe's going to be using this boat for beach cruising, and he wants to be able to lash all of his gear into the bottom of the boat so it doesn't go bouncing around if he's in rough seas. So we brainstormed a bunch of different ideas about how we can do this. It included putting some holes in the frames he could lash to, or attaching some pad eyes to the boat in some sort of way, putting some blocking in. Then I got the idea of a lashing rail. So a wooden rail that runs the whole length of the boat about 4 to 6 inches up from the bottom, so he can lash to it easily and it can lash all of his stuff down to it easily. So that's what we're going to do today. So why don't you sit back and relax, let me take care of the work. Okay, we're going to make some dowels, and I'm not talking about short stumpy dowels here. I'm talking like 10 feet, 12 feet, 16, 20 feet, whatever you need. A long dowel. Of course, short ones you can buy, but you can't always get them whatever species you want, and long ones you certainly can't buy easily. My local wood supplies place actually makes longish dowels. I suspect they could make them in any length I want, but I only need like 2. I'm not going to drive a half an hour to go and pick up a couple of long dowels if they even have one in the size that I want. So I years ago came up with a simple method for making my own. Now it doesn't involve using a dowel maker, so we're going to start with square stock in the same dimensions that you want your finished dowel to be in. And we're going to make a real simple little jig here, which is just a block of wood with that same dimension cut out of here, and you want just a little bit of wiggle room, you know, like an extra 16th to a 32nd, something in there. This is just a little undersized, but something like this, right? Okay, we're going to set this up on the table saw, and this is going to act a bit like a feather board, and it's just going to make it easier to pass a long whippy thing through the saw, and then we're going to use this again over at the router table. So we're going to set our saw up with the blade at 45 degrees, and we need to set the distance off the fence just so. So the way you do it is if you took the end of your dowel stock and you figured out exactly what an octagon would look like, that's what we're making right now. And the trick here is the 7-10-7 rule. So the 7-10-7 rule is a cool little piece of geometry that we use in wooden boat building for turning square things into round things. Specifically, we use it on spars, making masts and booms and things like that. So you can use this trick on not just spars and things like that, but even if you have oddball shapes, say things that are like trapezoidal, you can still use the 7-10-7 rule. And what it basically does is it's very simply takes a 4-sided thing and turns it into an 8-sided thing, and then a 16-sided thing, then a 32nd sided thing, using very simple geometry. Now we're not using dividers or anything like that. All you need is an imperial ruler, and it works particularly well with an imperial ruler because the inch conveniently divides up into 8. So let me show you that in practice. Okay, let's say for instance this is going to turn into, we'll say, a set of oars or a small boom. So the 7-10-7 rule easily allows us to lay out lines from which we can knock the corners off of this. Now of course you could just lay off an octagon on the end grain of something, but that's not necessarily as useful. So the way we use it is you would take a ruler, and we need to use 3 units off that ruler. So with this particular stock, I would swing the ruler so that the 0 touches on one edge, leaves the 3-inch mark touching the other edge. And we can draw a line across that for convenience. And then we simply measure 7/8 of an inch in from one end, and 7/8 of an inch in from the other end. And what that leaves us in between are 10/8, 7-10-7. We would then take those dimensions and we would just draw ourselves guidelines. Like so. You do the same thing on the next surface. Now if you're working with something that's perfectly square, all we have to do is lay that out once, set a marking gauge or something, and then we can lay out the next side. So if we look at that on the end grain and we were to chop those corners off, if laid out properly, this 10 units is now the same here. These corners are 10 units wide across the corners. So now we have 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. So it's an octagon, or very close to it. I know this drawing is not exactly accurate, but that's the theory. Do not get out a calculator and start crunching the numbers on this. I will ban you from the channel if I get any sort of math-related comments below. So in practice, we would simply knock the corners off of those. And then the beauty of this system is that we can do the same thing again. So now you would reduce your scale down. So I would say across one of these flats, we would go down to 1.5 inches. And we go 7/16 and 7/16 from either end. And that leaves 10/16 in the middle. And once again, we can draw guidelines. We do that on all 8 sides, and we knock the corners off again. And you can keep doing that as you go smaller and smaller. Now, of course, on a small stick, it doesn't make sense to do that, but on something larger like this, it makes a lot of sense. So on a larger stick like this, we would swing this ruler over to using the 6-inch mark. And now we would go with 7/4 and 7/4. And that leaves 10/4 in between. And again, we would draw our guidelines out, knock those corners off, and then we could divide this again. And this, now that we're into a smaller scale, we'd go back down to the 3-inch stretch, 7/8, 10/8, and 7/8, and so on. So 7/10/7, super convenient. Now you can make spar gauges like this for doing this. So this smaller one would be fine for a small spar like this. So these pins are set at 7, 10, and 7 from the inside edges of this. And we've got a wider one here for bigger stuff like this. Some people make these with pencils, and they'll drag the pencils out. I've never bothered with this. I just use a couple of pokes with these nails, and then I'll connect the dots with a ruler or something like that. Now, of course, doing our little lashing rails, we're working with something that's about 3/4 of an inch. And so that means that we're going to be using nominally the 1.5-inch span in order to lay off our 7/10/7 on that. And we're going to be using 7/16, 7/16, 10/16 in between. All right, so if you play around with that idea, say using a rhomboid type shape, you can get an egg shape very easily. So you can lay off those 7/10/7 around each of the sides. And although all the sides are different, when you use this methodology, it sort of brings it all into a cohesive, not circle obviously, but an ovoid shape, or whatever your primary form is. It's going to take that form and round it down. So that's really cool for doing interesting looking moldings and things like that. So go ahead and play around with that. It's really fun, and I actually use it all the time. I use it when I'm making banjo necks. I'll use the 7/10/7 to sort of do my initial layout lines for the shape of the banjo neck around the back side. I'll use it on anything that's got an organic form from which I'm starting off with a rectilinear form. Okay, we need to set our table saw for that. Okay, so I've already got my fence set. We're just going to take this block, we're just going to park it directly over that blade. We're going to clamp it to the fence. And make sure you don't clamp so low that that blade could rise up and hit your clamp, of course. I'll just set it to the back side here where it's not going to touch it. Okay, now we're going to fire up the saw. We're going to raise that blade until it's projecting through this void here. And it's going to raise the blade. Okay, right now that blade is basically projecting into that void just that tiny little amount. If I take this stick and run it in there, you'll see. Okay, so there we go. It's taken a little corner off of there. Now this stick is undersized, so it's not reading properly, but we're going to stick the full dimension one through there right now. Okay, that worked out pretty good. So if we look at our little jig here, you can see our saw blade was just sort of cutting into the side of it there. So that worked nicely. If I wanted to reuse this on the router table, what I would probably do is just like chop a chunk out of here. And that's so that there's plenty of room for the router chips to come flying out. You do have to be careful with routers, of course. They don't necessarily have the room around the bit that the table saw does. The reason I take the time to do that on the table saw is because, especially with sort of coarse-grained woods like oak, when you try and run these on a router table, your chance of it sort of splitting out is much, much higher. By using the table saw to sort of knock off the worst of the scrap, it gives the router a much smaller job to do. And so that process, the routering job, goes 4 times faster probably compared to if you didn't knock that corner off. And of course, knocking that corner off is really fast on the table saw. So there's a double advantage there. You do have to do a secondary machine setup, but I think it's well worth it. And it's less wear and tear on your router bits, which, let's face it, are relatively expensive compared to a table saw bit. Also, if you only had a table saw, this got you to an octagon. If you didn't have a router, you could sit down with just a spoke shave and you could knock this thing down to roundish pretty darn fast. I bet you it would take you, I don't know, 20 minutes, half an hour at the most to sort of work your way around this and knock off the edges. At least for sort of, folky type stuff, that would be fine. And the reason I started doing this is because if I'm doing skin on frame boats, I find dowels easier to wrap around a hull shape than rectangular or square shaped stringers. And especially if the stringer has got to take sort of a funny path from one end of the boat to the other, it can be hard to get squared off stringers to sort of lie nicely against ribs. Whereas once it's a dowel, it can just bend any which way you want, and it isn't going to affect how it lays against the ribs at all. So I think there's an advantage to doing that. I'll bet I could just throw these in the boat just like this, or just clean them up a little bit, and Joe would be perfectly happy. But I think we will actually stuff these through the router if. It's a big if. I'm not even sure I can get these through the router right now because my router table is at the tail end of my table saw, and my table saw is very much restricted by the boat. Even to use the router table, I've got to find some pretty goofy path to run this thing through. So I'm gonna have to think about that for a bit. But there you go. That's just sort of a quick and dirty way of getting at least close to round. I'm trying to turn this thing around. I don't even know if I can turn it around, but it's the only way I'm going to be able to use my router table. There's like a volume of dust and crap under here that has not been swept in a decade at least. It's like every inch I move it, there's another giant pile of sawdust. Good. Good. All right. Let's get the router set up. So for years I've made dowels with just a quarter round over bit, and that works fine. And especially if your stock is still square, it actually works really quite well because the squareness registers the stick as it passes through the router bit. It still works with the octagon. However, it's just a little bit harder to get the octagon to register. Now I've also got this full half round bit on the router right now, so I might go with that. I think I will go with that. I can get it down to 2 passes then. But I've always really quite liked the round over bit, because then, you know, it always registers against the dowel itself and makes it really easy to sort of set things up. This is the very first Veritas router table. In fact, this is actually one of their very first runs before they went into full production. This was a prototype run that when I worked at Lee Valley Tools for a little while in one of the stores in Toronto, and so when they first came out with the router table, they sent a bunch of them to the store. First few samples, and I think it was they decided that these plates didn't meet their specs for accuracy. I forget what it was, but they didn't cut the mustard, so they made them available to the employees if we wanted to buy them off them for relatively cheap. I don't remember what relatively cheap was, but it was a whole lot cheaper than they were charging for the real thing. 3/4 inch dowels. Good. All right. So I designed this little router table fence to fit up against my table saw fence here and just clamp onto it. And it's set up so you can stick a vacuum in shop vac right in the top here to help get rid of all your shreddings. Works pretty good. Let's see. Do a couple test drives and then we'll set up feather boards and such. Okay, that came out nicely. Now, what do we want to do about feather boards and such? Let's see. I think that's going to be okay, and I'd like to have one that holds it down too. Let's see what we got. The challenge in this shop is just finding the stupid little resources you need to do this stuff while clambering around all the junk that's in your way. And there's a lot of junk in my way. Okay, I think that'll do it. Well, there we go, not too shabby. One of them's got a little bit of a flat spot here. I guess I over trimmed something, just a hair. Anyhow, it's not a big deal, not for what I need it for. But that worked out great. I'm just gonna give these a good sanding and then they're ready to go into the boat. So there we go, there's some quick and dirty dowel making. So results of course depend on how accurate you are to start with. That's a little bit sloppy to be honest, which is probably why I got one of these dowels with a little bit of a flat spot and why I had to sort of send them through in more than 2 passes. Not really a big deal. I was gonna, if I'd used a 1/4 round bed, I would have been doing it in 4 passes anyway. It takes no time at all to send it through for a pass, and that's the beauty of this sort of setup, is once you just stuff it in one end, there's enough feather boards and junk in place that all you gotta do is grab the other end and just walk it out the door, basically. If you need dowels, just go ahead and make them. Don't worry about trying to shop around for stuff like this. It's easy enough to make, at least in larger sizes. I would not bother trying to do this for anything smaller than, say, 3/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch. Okay, 1/2 an inch. I do have a pile of yellow cedar ones that are about 16, 20 feet long and 1/2 an inch. Okay, admittedly, I've got a bunch of 1/4 inch ones that are 10 feet long here, so I guess do whatever you want. All right, we've run out of time in this video to finish up this part of the project, so we'll take care of that in the next video, and I really hope you'll join me for that. Now remember, these videos are supported by my followers on Patreon, so if you can join me over there, I really appreciate that. You can find links in the corner or down in the description. Okay folks, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Catch you later.